Wednesday, 2 September 1942. Dear Kitty, Mr. and Mrs. Von Dan have had a terrific quarrel. I've never seen anything quite like it before. Mummy and Daddy would never dream of shouting at each other. The cause was so trivial that the whole thing was a pure waste of breath, but still everyone to his own liking. Naturally, it is very unpleasant for Peter, who has to stand by. No one takes him seriously. He is so frightfully touchy and lazy. Yesterday he was badly upset because he found that his tongue was blue instead of red. This unusual phenomena of nature disappeared just as quickly as it had come. Today he is going about with a scarf on as he has a stiff neck. In addition, my lord complains of lumbago. Pains around the heart, kidneys, and lungs are not unusual either. He is a real hypochondria. That's the word for such people, isn't it? It is not all honey between Mummy and Mrs. Van Daan. There is plenty of cause for unpleasantness. To give a small example, I will tell you that Mrs. Van Daan has taken all three of her sheets out of the common linen cupboard. She takes it for granted that Mummy's sheets will do for all of us. It will be a nasty surprise for her when she finds that Mummy has followed her good example. Although she is thoroughly piqued that her dinner service and not ours is in use, she is always trying to find out where we have actually put our plates. They are closer than she thinks. They are in a cupboard box behind a lot of junk in the attic. Our plates are ungettable at as long as we are here, and a good thing too. I always have bad luck. I smashed one of Mrs. Von Dan's soup plates into 1,000 pieces yesterday. Oh, she cried angrily. Couldn't you be careful for once? That's the last one I've got. Mrs. Von Dan is all sugar to me nowadays. Long may it last. Mummy gave me another frightful summons this morning. I can't bear them. Our ideas are completely opposite. Daddy is a darling, although he can sometimes be angry with me for 5 minutes on end. Last week we had a little interruption in our monotonous life. It was over a book about women and Peter. First, I must tell you that Margaret and Peter are allowed to read nearly all the books that Mr. Coofius lends us, but the grown ups held back this particular book on the subject of women. Peter's curiosity was aroused at once. What was it the two of them were not allowed to read in this book? He got hold of the book on the sly while his mother was downstairs talking and disappeared with his booty to the attic. All went well for a few days. His mother knew what he was doing but didn't tell tales until father found out. He was very angry, took the book away, and thought that would finish the whole business. However, he had not allowed for his son's curiosity, which waxed rather than waned because of his father's attitude. Peter, determined to finish it, thought of a way to get hold of this enthralling book. In the meantime, Mrs. Von Dan had asked Mummy what she thought about it all. Mummy thought this particular book was not suitable for Margaret, but she saw no harm in letting her read more books. Most books. There is a great difference, Mrs. Von Dan, said Mummy, between Margaret and Peter. In the first place, Margaret is a girl, and girls are always more grown up than boys. Secondly, Margaret has read quite a lot of serious books and does not go in search of things that are forbidden her. And thirdly, Margaret is far more developed and intelligent, shown by the fact of her being in the fourth form at school. Mrs. Von Dan agreed, but still thought it was wrong in principle to let children read books which were written for grown ups. In the meantime, Peter had found a time of the day when no one bothered about him or the book, 7:30 in the evening. Then everyone was in the private office listening to the radio. That was when he took his treasure to the attic again. He should have been downstairs again by 8:30, but because the book was so thrilling, he forgot the time and was just coming downstairs as his father came into his room. You can imagine the consequences. With a slap and a snatch, the book lay on the table and Peter was in the attic. That's how matters stood as we sat down to table. Peter stayed upstairs, no one bothered about him, and he had to go to bed without any supper. We went on with the meal, chattering gaily, when suddenly we heard a piercing whistle. We all stopped eating and looked with pale, changed faces from one to another. Then we heard Peter's voice calling down the chimney. I say I'm not coming down anyway. Mrs. Van Daan sprang to his feet. His napkin fell to the floor, and scarlet in the face he shouted, "I've had enough of this." Daddy took his arm, afraid of what might happen, and the two men went together to the attic. After a good deal of resistance and stamping, Peter landed up in his room with the door closed, and we went on eating. Mrs. Van Daan wanted to save one slice of bread for the dear boy, but his father stood firm. If he doesn't apologize soon, he will have to sleep in the attic. Long protest from the rest of us, as we thought missing supper was quite enough punishment. Besides, Peter might catch cold and we couldn't call a doctor. Peter did not apologize. He was already in the attic. Mr. Van Daan did nothing more about it, but I noticed the next morning that Peter's bed had been slept in. Peter was back in the attic at 7 o'clock, but Daddy managed with a few friendly words to persuade him to come down again. Sour faces and obstinate silences for 3 days, and then everything went smoothly once more. Yours, Annie.